Welcome back. Now that we've covered the Peloponnesian War as a whole military historical unit in ancient Athenian history, we're now going to turn to a more specific overview of the events in the Peloponnesian War that relate to the 5 plays of Aristophanes that you're reading in the course. I'm going to devote a separate video to some summary information about the plays. Of course, you can also go to your schedule, and for each of the plays that we're going to be talking about, you will be able to find the references to the plays in the listing for the schedule and see summary information, background about the plays, what the plays are about, themes, and so forth. So make sure you use those. So that will help you to study for the plots of the plays when you get to your midterm and final exams. But what I'll do here is, in addition to recapping for you the plots of the plays and explaining some of the highlights, hopefully making the plays also more humorous for you, I will also relate them back to the Peloponnesian War, because all of these plays occurred during the Peloponnesian War and reflected directly upon it through the characters in the plays. So we want to make sure that those links, connections are clear for you so that you will appreciate both the history and the plays better. Okay, we'll begin with our first play, Clouds, 423 BC. Now, Clouds was produced about 7 years after Aristophanes began his formal career as a playwright, so far as we could tell from other evidence. This play, in fact, is the third play that we have surviving. Acarnians was the first one in 425 BC, and Knights was the second one in 424 BC. So then we have Clouds produced in 423 BC. Now, we don't know too much about the earlier plays of Aristophanes as far as their prizes, but we know that Aristophanes hit a high point in his career with Acarnians when he got first prize, and did the same thing with Knights in 424 BC when again he got first prize. But here he dropped down very badly. When we got to Clouds, the play was unsuccessful and received third place, and Aristophanes was evidently pretty mad about it, because when he came back the next year to talk about his lack of success with the play in the Parabasis of Wasps, he was pretty unhappy. And he let the audience know exactly what he thought of their very poor judgment, in his opinion. Now, what is maybe one reason why Clouds was unsuccessful? Well, one problem is that this was a period when the war was actually not active. I'm going to describe that in more detail first before we go back to talk about Clouds in particular. So you may remember from the previous video that there were 3 phases of the Peloponnesian War, and the first one from 431 to 421 BC was called the Archidamian War, because it was named after King Archidamus of Sparta, who was the one who prosecuted the war on behalf of the Spartans against the Athenians. Now, that phase of the war went back and forth indeterminately. From 431 all the way down to 421 BC, when it was concluded with the Peace of Nicaeas. The problem that both sides ran into was that they really did not have a real understanding of how involved this war really was for both of them, and they did not have anywhere near the resources or the capabilities that they thought they had, each side, to be able to bring the war to a successful conclusion. In addition to that, the Athenians themselves discovered that they had fallen well short of the amount of money they thought they'd have, chiefly because of the siege of Potidæa near the beginning of the war. And so by the time you get down to 423 BC, both sides were really pretty emotionally bankrupt from the war, quite frankly, not to mention financially bankrupt. When we got to 423 BC, both sides have suffered very severe losses. The Athenians had, in the previous year, suffered the devastating military loss at Delium in 424 BC. We know that the philosopher Socrates was in that battle in Delium, and in a later work, Plato's Symposium, there is a description of how Socrates rescued the general Alcibiades, who figures very prominently in the war in its later phase. it's possible that maybe because of the notoriety attached to Socrates in 424 BC because of Delia, maybe that is a reason why he appears here, although the theme of this play, of course, is not military, so it's hard to know whether that connection is a secure one. But it is an interesting point that right after an especially notable event for Socrates, there he is appearing in a play. So there's that. So the Athenians had suffered that terrible loss. But the Spartans had suffered the loss of their prisoners at Pylos in 425 BC, the prisoners who were taken to Athens and being held there. And the Spartans also had the island of Kythera to their south offshore, being held as a fortress against them by the Athenians. The Athenians also were to discover eventually that they lost the fort called Panactum when they suffered the major loss at Delia. But most bothersome for the Athenians of all, of course, was the loss of that city Amphipolis up in the north, the one that Brasidas managed to trick Thucydides out of in order to be able to get. So, with all that going on, we have both sides really not in a position to keep the war going, and both sides call a ceasefire. So in 423 BC, there was a one-year armistice between the two sides, and it's during this armistice that, without a lot of war effort going on, that we have the production of clouds. And it's possible that Aristophanes attempted to vary away from the war, since it wasn't really current discussion at that point, in order to focus on another aspect of Athenian society that apparently disturbed him quite a bit, and that was the education system. If that was his intent, it's quite clear from the outcome of the play, its third prize, that the Athenian audience didn't buy it. So now let's turn to clouds itself. The first thing to understand is that the version of clouds that we have surviving, unfortunately, is not the one that was originally produced. The version we have surviving probably dates to something like 418 BC, but that version, the one that we now have, was never produced on stage. We do not know exactly why that is, but you can read the appendix in your translation of Aristophanes by Meinecke, in which he describes this in full detail. Just to summarize right at the moment, the changes that appear to have been made from the original plot to the current plot are the agom, the dispute that goes on between the two logics, or the two arguments, appears to have been either added completely to this play or revised considerably from the original play. The ending is definitely different. Apparently, the burning down scene that we have in the current play was not, again, either was considerably revised or was not at all present in the original scene. And then there are also some other major changes, including obviously with the parabasis of the current play, in which there's a reference to the fact that the play lost, and obviously that means that the parabasis has to come from later. Also, there is a reference, you may have noticed, to somebody named Hyperbolus, and Hyperbolus is not prominent in Athenian politics until around the 418, 417 BC time. That's why we usually assume it's 418 BC, because he was current in politics at that time, and so that reference to a later Athenian politician means that parabasis clearly has to be from later than the original production. So the unfortunate thing for us is that we don't really know exactly why Clouds was so unsuccessful, since we don't really have the original play surviving. But there are still some points of speculation that we can make, and I'll come into those as we go through the play itself. So the essential plot of Clouds, you may have noticed, in a way almost reads like a Greek tragedy in a rather odd way. You have the figure Strepsiades, the twister, his name means in Greek, Strepsiades. He is an elderly man who is in debt, and he's in debt because his very rich, rather spoiled brat son, Pheidippides, whose name in Greek means the sparer of horses, goes around gambling. And it's important to know that any name that is associated with horses, like Pheidippides, implies aristocracy, because only wealthy citizens in Athens would be able to afford horses. So we're told that Pheidippides' mother was in fact from a wealthy family, and we suspect that there was a lot of social uppityness going along with that between somebody living in the city versus somebody living in the country. So that's obviously reflected in the relationship here. So Strepsiades has a major debt problem. And he's heard, however, that at this mysterious place called the Frontisterion, or the Thinkery, that they teach how to get out of debt. So he sends his son Phidippides over there in order to learn how to do it. But Phidippides says, no, I won't get involved in that. And so Strepsiades realizes that the only way he's going to be able to learn this argument is to go do it himself, even though he is definitely mentally unfit for the prospect of trying to learn something brand new. All right, so Strepsiades goes to the school, and as you will see in the play, there's a lot of goings-on between Strepsiades and Socrates. Socrates looks quite absurd, suspended up in his basket, trying to watch astronomical phenomena. Socrates apparently studies rather strange things like how far a flea can jump, we're told, together with his famous student Chaerephon. So this is a weird place, and even at the beginning, Strepsiades is a little bit puzzled by this, but he wants to hear about how to get out of debt, so in he goes. So Strepsiades gets initiated into the school by the clouds, who are the chorus, and he begins trying to learn the ways that Socrates teaches things, but in the end, as you saw, it doesn't work out. So then Strepsiades has to go back and try to get his son to go, and this time the son agrees to go. There is then at the school this dispute, the agon, between the two arguments. You have the so-called stronger argument, which is the old-fashioned one that refers to the days of the Battle of Marathon, and then you have the weaker one, the so-called wrong logic, whereas the other one could be called the right logic. The wrong logic talks about contemporary interests that have a lot more to do with what's in it for me, and a lot less about the proper spirit one should have to improving one's city, as the veterans did at Marathon, as the stronger argument would say. So you have right logic and wrong logic. If you read both logics, though, neither one is really all that convincing. Right logic is very prurient in its description of what was appropriate in the old days, especially the way he talks about boys, whereas wrong logic appears to be very dismissive of morality altogether. And when right logic points out that certain elements of wrong logic's argument could get somebody to suffer certain rather unpleasant punishments, like with a radish, the wrong logic basically rebuts the right logic very effectively by saying, look in the audience. And he probably was pointing at the real audience. Look at everybody here. Don't you see? Look at their condition. And right logic is stunned to realize, wait a minute, everybody's doing what wrong logic wants. And he actually ends up throwing away his cloak and jumping into the audience in order to join them, as it turns out. And so wrong logic wins. So what wrong logic successfully does is something that is attributed to the sophist Protagoras. We'll talk about sophists in just a minute. But the Protagoras taught the ability to make a weak argument appear strong. In other words, better than what the real strong argument would have been. And essentially, that's what this wrong logic is doing. So Phidippides ends up being instructed in the means of the wrong logic and ends up learning how to get his father out of debt, which is great because his father now knows how to talk himself out of any situation that he comes into that's negative, especially regarding money. Unfortunately, however, Phidippides then goes to a dinner party with his father. They have a dispute regarding which playwright is the best quality one to recite, whether it's Aeschylus or Sophocles, which is what Strepsiades wants, versus Euripides, the bad guy, always in Aristophanes, the one that Phidippides wants. In the dispute, Phidippides starts whacking his father. And so they come on stage where the son is whacking the father, and the son comes up with a wrong logic method of justifying why it's okay for the son to beat the father. After all, didn't the father beat the son before for disciplinary purposes? The father's actually convinced. But then the son says, now I'm going to go beat my mother too. And now the father is enraged. And it's at that point that the clouds take on their tragic aspect. The clouds are these deities who've been watching all this going on, and they've been monitoring Strepsiades' progress. And now they finally come and step forward and reveal that they had essentially led Strepsiades down the proverbial primrose path in order to catch him in a trap, to indicate to him that his behavior was in fact quite morally unacceptable. Once Strepsiades goes through a kind of tragic anagnorisis or recognition in Aristotle's term, he then ends up inflicting punishment upon those who taught him this malevolent way of thinking by setting fire to the Frontisterion, and we see Socrates and Chaerephon and the students scattering in panic at the very end of the play as Strepsiades and his slaves apply torches to the building. So it's a very unusual play in this sense, and the clouds even depart without any real kind of festivity the way one would normally expect. Instead, they basically say, well, we guess we've taken care of everything satisfactorily here, and it's odd. We don't quite know exactly why the chorus acts this way. One curious parallel to mention about that finale is Socrates wrote a play called Electra, which was based loosely on a prior trilogy of plays called Aristeia by Aeschylus. These are two tragic playwrights. And the conclusion of Electra, in which Orestes, the son of Agamemnon and Clytemnestra, has already inflicted vengeance upon his mother Clytemnestra because she murdered her husband, his father, Agamemnon, when he arrived home from the Trojan War. And at the end of the play, Orestes is about to murder the lover of Clytemnestra named Aegisthus, who happens to be the cousin of the deceased Agamemnon. He drags him into the palace, about to murder him as well in order to complete his mission of vengeance. And at that point, the chorus makes a very similar dismissive comment of, well, okay, everything has worked out well. And again, in both cases, we have this rather strange feeling that maybe the end of the play is incomplete, or we're not exactly sure why the playwright thought that it was appropriate to end so briefly and so abruptly in this way. So in any event, Clouds is really a highlight of the educational system in Athens, and in Greece in general, in fact. The figure of Socrates is kind of an enigmatic one in this play, because according to Plato's Apology and Xenophon's Apology, when Socrates was famously on trial and he was about to drink hemlock, Socrates claimed that playwrights like Aristophanes had smeared him or distorted his point of view, just as we see in this play, that in fact he never acted as a sophist. So now that brings up the question, who exactly is a sophist? A sophist was a paid traveling educator in ancient Greece. Many of them would travel around for pay. They might, in some cases, set up schools. They would have groups of students come to see them, and they would teach a variety of different subjects, which could be practical subjects like military, cooking, and so forth, mathematics. They could teach the arts. They could teach different types of reading and so forth. And very importantly, they could also teach rhetoric, especially how to make language poetic, or to maneuver language. One of the most renowned sophists, I will give you his name here, came from a Sicilian city called Leontini. And his name is Gorgias. And there are references to Gorgias and other works, including those of Plato, to know that he was quite influential. And if you read Euripides' tragedies, you see places where he uses rhythm or rhyme, very much the way that Gorgias would do, and even some of Plato's dialogues with Socrates it places some influence. So Gorgias was one of the most influential sophists, but there were in fact quite a few others. And again, the sophist Protagoras is the one who is most renowned for the purpose of this play, because he taught many different kinds of precepts that were quite controversial in their day, one of which was that man was the measure of all things, that in fact the gods really didn't count that much in human affairs. And if you remember in this play, we have the whole issue about the Olympian gods not being the real gods. The clouds have now taken over and have become the real gods. This world thing, Dinos, which is also a pot, earthenware pot, is now the actual god. So the idea of supplanting the old gods with new gods, which is something that is attributed to Socrates himself, and he's actually accused of in his trial, something that's also talked about with the playwright Euripides. All of that suggests that the old-fashioned forms of worship and old-fashioned morality are all being replaced with a newer form of morality that's, again, is more selfish, more individual-based, like what can I get out of a situation? How can I take advantage of things? Instead of observing proper morality and thinking of one's city or one's fellow man more. So, so this kind of thinking, and especially this kind of teaching, is what appears to be of grave concern with Aristophanes in Clouds. And he uses the figure of Socrates probably because Socrates was a familiar figure, and again, maybe as a tribute, a small tribute to Socrates for his unusual success in rescuing Alcibiades in the Battle of Delium the previous year. So Socrates ends up being essentially the poster child for sophistry, which again he probably was a not particularly happy about, as in fact comes across an apology. Although we do have a commentator that says that Socrates was in the audience watching this play, and when it concluded, he was the first one to get up and applaud. So apparently Socrates liked the play, even if nobody else did. Okay, so so the education system is Aristophanes' focus here. And again, he's probably focusing on this subject because he doesn't have any war subjects due to the armistice. Now, the education system, as we said, involves a lot of these private instructors. The idea of a school, the way we think of it today, is more of a 4th century BC concept with Plato, and then more formally with Aristotle later. So we don't really have that going on here. We do have teachers who can run schools. They're referred to as rhetores, but we don't really have a full sense of like a university or college or anything like that quite yet in this time period. So one of the potential risks that one runs with sophists is that one is dependent upon them as the experts, and we don't have any real way to check on the quality of what they're teaching. So of course you can get quackery. And eventually sophists did indeed come up against a bad reputation as a group for teaching stuff that either wasn't really all that practical or useful in society, or was just simply outright false. It might even have been fraudulent. And so we can't be sure to what extent sophists could continue to teach their subjects effectively, given the suspicion that was attached to them. But it's pretty clear that from this play, that there was a lot of thought going around about exactly how boys were being educated in this time, especially during a wartime. One of the major concerns Aristophanes might have been raising here is, if you're going to believe sophists, or you're going to listen to Socrates with all of his questioning babble, or you're going to read the plays of Euripides, or watch the plays of Euripides, or you're going to question people in authority, all that's well and good if one wants to do that. But the problem with that is, if you do not pay attention to what's going on in your city, especially when you are in a state of war, it is possible for you to be ignorant about matters that really matter to you and everybody else. And as a result, major mistakes in policy can be made. So although Aristophanes doesn't necessarily point directly to the war in this play, it's possible that he is trying to indicate to his audience in a comic way that maybe they should pay more attention to exactly how their kids are being schooled, because these are the kids who eventually will be the soldiers and government officials and politicians and community leaders of the future potentially. And if they really have been brought up on defective education, then they're likely to carry out equally defective policies on behalf of the city. Okay, so just to summarize, for the Peloponnesian War, the Clouds is produced in a year when we do not have the war active, because there is a peace treaty temporarily between the two states, Sparta and Athens. They have temporarily stopped fighting the war in order to deal with their various losses, lick their wounds, and try to assess exactly what will happen with the war. The next play in the next video, Wasps, is produced just before the war rages back out of control again, and we'll turn to that in our next video. We'll see you then.